On the banks of this river in Korea in 1951, America, Britain and their United Nations allies were locked in a battle with tens of thousands of communist troops. What moved the Allies to cross the world to fight here in Korea, only 5 years after the bloodshed of the Second World War, was their drive to stop communism spreading further. I'll be revealing the dramatic reversals in military fortunes of the armies of the capitalist West and the communist East. And telling the story of how events in Korea nearly spiraled out of control, raising the spectre of nuclear war.
The Korean War was waged by men from 24 different countries around the world. Men divided by ideology, but also by the way they fought. On one hand, massive firepower. On the other, overwhelming numbers. I'll be telling the story of what it was like for the ground troops when these two very different armies clashed. And describing the brutal fighting often waged in extreme conditions across the entire Korean peninsula.
This is the story of a largely forgotten conflict, and of the battle that took place here on the Imjin River during the Communist Spring Offensive of 1951. A battle that was to be a turning point in the war for Korea. I'm on a journey to perhaps the world's strangest border, the border between North and South Korea. Right now, I'm about to enter the South Korean side of the 4-kilometer wide security zone that straddles the entire length of the boundary. This zone is effectively a no-go area, policed by troops from the United Nations, marked out by miles of barbed wire fences and defended with landmines. At the border itself, there are no fences or gates. Here, the border is simply marked by this block of concrete, just 4 inches high, yet absolutely no one is allowed to step across. Guarding the border on the south side stand the soldiers of the South Korean Army. Immediately opposite, the men of the North Korean Army. The only place along the entire border that the two sides are in direct communication is on this spot, where a few huts literally straddle the border. Strictly speaking, standing here, I'm in South Korean territory. But if I step beyond this table here, in theory, I'm inside North Korea. Although practically speaking, the mysterious country of North Korea lies beyond that guarded and locked door over there. So, how come such a bizarre situation exists here? Well, the fact is that North and South Korea are still officially at war, and have been for more than half a century. Before the Second World War, the entire Korean peninsula was under the control of Japan. But when Japan was defeated, the victors divided the country along this line of latitude here, the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union sponsored a communist regime up here in the north, under Kim Il-sung in his capital, Pyongyang, and the Americans put Syngman Rhee, a fiercely right-wing nationalist, in control of South Korea in his capital, Seoul. Syngman Rhee wanted to govern not just South Korea, but the entire peninsula. He wanted to unite North and South under a capitalist regime. In the north, His opposite number and bitter enemy, Kim Il-sung, also wanted to unify the Korean peninsula, but under the banner of communism. Each man had his dream of unifying Korea under his rule, but neither of them did very much about it. Until just after 4 a.m. on the 25th of June 1950, when, without any warning, North Korea invaded the South.
Within hours, 130,000 men of the North Korean army were pouring across the border. The North Korean army caught the South Koreans utterly unprepared. The South Koreans could barely muster a fighting force. Outgunned and overwhelmed by enemy tanks, the ill-equipped army were rapidly forced back.
Even though we fired our guns at them, the tanks were not damaged at all. We could not destroy them. We were in a panic. We couldn't resist the enemy. It was terrifying.
In just 48 hours, the communist soldiers were poised to attack the South Korean capital, Seoul. Seoul was the jewel in the crown of South Korea, and the North Korean army's attack on it was swift and certain. The communists burst through these narrow streets, meeting little resistance as they took control. The North Korean troops swamped the city. And by June the 28th, just 3 days after the invasion, communist flags were flying over Seoul. But the North Koreans didn't stop here in Seoul. They pushed on southwards, aiming to take the whole peninsula in the name of communism. They crossed rivers, they traversed mountains, and they defeated the weak South Korean army at every encounter. For the North Koreans, it was beginning to look like a walkover.
The West and its allies feared the North's seizure of South Korea would be another dangerous advance of communism throughout the world. And the West was determined to do something about it. The Americans took the lead in persuading the United Nations to go to the defense of South Korea. Now, the Soviet Union could have vetoed this proposal, but they weren't there. In the Soviet Union's absence, the vote was passed. For the first time, the United Nations was going to war. 21 nations from around the world, including Britain, would send men and equipment to Korea. But there would be no doubt as to who would be in charge. America, by far the biggest single force, was in command. The fighting in Korea was no longer a small skirmish in a far-flung country. It had dragged in a superpower.
Within days, Allied troops began to flood into South Korea. American troops were the first of the UN forces to arrive in Korea, shipped in from their bases in nearby Japan. And they entered here, through Korea's southernmost port, Busan. When they landed, they faced a desperate situation, and it was getting worse. because by now, the South Korean army had almost totally collapsed under the advance of the North Korean steamroller. But the American troops were virtually powerless to improve matters, because these were not the same battle-hardened, well-equipped men that had been victorious in the Second World War.
We had equipment left over from World War II, most of which had been in a warehouse someplace, and it was from unserviceable to non-existent. We were in a very poor shape for everything. We were not ready to fight a war. That's the long and the short of it.
Just weeks after setting foot on Korean soil, the American land forces faced a terrible humiliation. By now, the North Koreans controlled nearly the whole of the Korean peninsula. And this meant that the American troops and their South Korean allies were packed into an increasingly tight corner, an area that became known as the Pusan Perimeter. This was a tiny pocket of land, just 50 miles by 50 miles around the port of Pusan in the southernmost tip of the peninsula. Everywhere else was in North Korean hands. The United Nations forces were surrounded and in danger of being pushed out of Korea altogether.
What was needed to rescue the United Nations forces from disaster was a bold stroke from a decisive leader. And that's exactly what they got from the man in charge, the American General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was one of those commanders who was larger than life. He was America's most decorated officer in the First World War, and he relished the fame he'd won, leading the defeat of Japan in the Second World War. Now the Korean War gave the aging general a chance of yet another triumph. MacArthur knew that if he was to push Kim Il-sung's Communist Army back into North Korea, he'd have to come up with a much more ambitious strategy than simply battling it out on the Pusan perimeter. In World War II, MacArthur's greatest victories had been achieved through amphibious landings, sending troops in by sea to attack behind enemy lines. Such landings carried grave risks, but MacArthur was convinced he had mastered the technique. MacArthur now proposed to use the same strategy in Korea, with a bold attempt to take the pressure off his forces trapped in this chokehold in the southeast of the peninsula. He would deliver an amphibious hammer blow, not down here around Pusan, but 150 miles behind enemy lines to the northwest, at the port city of Incheon. If he could seize Incheon, his troops could move on to Seoul, a mere 20 miles inland, cut the North Koreans off from behind, and force them to fight on two fronts, here and here. The North Koreans would be surrounded and crushed. But a landing at Incheon would be a high-risk exercise. The harbour city was placed at the end of a treacherous passage called Flying Fish Channel, where the tide raced in and out twice a day. When the tide fell by as much as 11 meters or 36 feet, vast mudflats were exposed, making an approach impossible. Even when the tide was in, the city was protected by high sea walls and a fortified island at the mouth of the harbour